My name is Andrea Mileson, and I spent 4 years at Paragon Systems building something most people never see but everyone depends on, the failure reporting infrastructure. While my colleagues chased glory in feature development and user experience, designing flashy interfaces and bragging about user engagement metrics, I was the one who made sure we knew when things broke, why they broke, and how to fix them before customers even noticed. I was the digital equivalent of a smoke detector, invisible until absolutely essential. The conference room smelled like vanilla air freshener and broken dreams when my manager, Kevin, delivered the news. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that particular frequency that makes everything feel slightly surreal. Andrea, we're restructuring the launch team. Management wants to give newer voices a shot. He couldn't meet my eyes, shuffling papers that probably contained my replacement's resume alongside performance reviews that would never mention how many disasters I'd prevented. The irony wasn't lost on me. In a room full of people half my age, I was apparently the old guard at 32. The mahogany conference table reflected the harsh lighting as Kevin continued his rehearsed speech about fresh perspectives and innovative approaches. Behind him, the whiteboard still had traces of my disaster recovery flowchart from last month's planning session, the one that had saved us from a catastrophic data breach that would have made headlines. Of course, I said, maintaining the same professional smile I'd perfected over years of being the only woman in most technical meetings. I'm sure the new team will do great. I could feel the weight of my badge in my pocket, the one that granted me access to the server rooms and monitoring systems that kept this place running. Soon, that access would be transferred to someone who probably thought a system failure was just a temporary inconvenience. What I didn't say was that I'd spent the last 6 months building a custom monitoring system that could predict product failures before they cascaded into customer-facing disasters. The system was a masterpiece of predictive analytics, machine learning algorithms, and pure intuition, a digital crystal ball that could see trouble coming from miles away. What I didn't mention was that this system lived entirely in my head and my personal documentation I'd been meaning to formalize but never quite found the time between putting out fires and attending meetings about putting out fires. The system wasn't just code, it was an ecosystem of triggers, alerts, and escalation procedures that I'd refined through countless late nights and weekend emergencies. It knew that when error rates spiked in the authentication module on Friday afternoons, it usually meant someone had pushed untested code. It understood that customer complaints about slow loading were actually early warnings of database performance issues. It was my digital extension, and now they wanted to hand it over to someone who probably thought debugging was something you did to insects. The new team was everything management wanted, young, enthusiastic, and completely unaware of the intricate web of dependencies that kept our product launches from becoming public relations nightmares. Jake, my replacement, was a recent graduate from Stanford with impressive credentials and the kind of competent ignorance that makes middle management swoon. He had perfectly styled hair, wore designer sneakers to work, and spoke in the kind of tech buzzwords that made executives nod knowingly. I watched from my newly assigned desk in the corner. Suddenly I was transitioning to strategic planning, as they dove headfirst into launch preparations. My new workspace was a study in corporate passive aggression, a smaller desk, positioned so I could see the team I'd been removed from but couldn't easily participate in their discussions. The motivational posters on the wall seemed to mock me with their cheerful proclamations about teamwork and innovation. They had energy, I'll give them that. They also had absolutely no idea what they were doing. Jake had immediately reorganized the team structure, creating subcommittees for things that had never needed committees. There was now a failure response strategy group and a customer experience impact assessment team. They were building bureaucracy where I had built efficiency. Andrea, Jake approached my desk one afternoon, 2 weeks into his tenure. His confidence had dimmed slightly, replaced by the kind of worry that comes from realizing you might be in over your head. Do you know where the failure escalation procedures are documented? I looked up from my strategic planning, which mostly involved updating my LinkedIn profile and reading articles about workplace dynamics. Did you check the wiki? Yeah, but it's pretty sparse. Just says, contact Andrea for details. He held up a printout of the wiki page, highlighting the pathetic 3-line entry that was supposed to represent 4 years of accumulated knowledge. Of course it did. Because for 4 years, I had been the details. I was the living, breathing repository of institutional knowledge about everything that could go wrong with a product launch. I knew that the payment processing system always hiccuped during high-traffic periods, that the notification service had a memory leak that manifested after exactly 72 hours of continuous operation, and that the third-party API we relied on for user authentication had a tendency to time out during their maintenance windows they never bothered to announce. "I'll send you what I have," I said, which was technically true. What I had was a lot, but what I could reconstruct from memory and scattered notes would be significantly less comprehensive. The real knowledge was in the muscle memory, the intuitive understanding of how systems behaved under stress, the ability to look at a string of error codes and immediately know whether it was a minor hiccup or the beginning of a complete system failure. The internal Slack channels became my entertainment. I watched the new team navigate problems I'd solved years ago, reinventing wheels and building bridges to nowhere. They had meetings about the meetings they would need to have about potential issues. Jake created a detailed project plan with color-coded timelines and resource allocation charts, beautiful to look at, completely useless in practice. Meanwhile, I could see the real problems building in the metrics, subtle shifts in user behavior, error rates creeping up in ways that would compound during launch stress. The authentication system was showing signs of the memory leak I'd identified months ago. The database query performance was degrading in that particular way that meant we were about to hit a scalability wall. Customer support tickets were increasing in frequency and complexity, suggesting that users were already experiencing the early warning signs of system instability. I tried to raise these concerns during the weekly team meetings I was still occasionally invited to. "The error logs are showing some concerning patterns," I'd say, only to be met with polite nods and assurances that the new monitoring dashboard would catch anything important. The dashboard, of course, only showed surface-level metrics, like trying to diagnose a heart condition by checking someone's complexion. The most frustrating part was watching them struggle with problems that had elegant solutions. They spent 3 days trying to figure out why customer complaints weren't being properly categorized, not realizing that the classification algorithm depended on a specific format in the subject line, a format I'd established through careful analysis of customer communication patterns. They treated symptoms while ignoring the underlying disease. Launch day arrived with the kind of artificial excitement that corporate environments manufacture for milestone events. There were balloons in the break room, someone had ordered bagels from the expensive place downtown, and the energy was infectious, except I felt more like a pathologist watching a patient flatline. The launch team had gathered in the war room, a conference room they'd renamed for the occasion and decorated with printouts of success metrics and inspirational quotes about innovation. I was in the break room, making my third cup of coffee and watching the launch coverage on the small TV mounted in the corner. The local tech news was covering our product launch as part of their weekly innovation segment. The anchor was speaking enthusiastically about Paragon Systems' revolutionary new approach to customer service automation. If only they knew what was happening behind the scenes. The first signs of trouble were subtle, a slight uptick in error rates that would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. But I'd been monitoring the systems from my strategic planning desk, unable to resist keeping an eye on the metrics. The authentication service was showing the early signs of the memory leak I'd predicted. Response times were increasing incrementally, the kind of gradual degradation that builds into a catastrophic failure. Then I heard the first panicked voice from the war room. "Error rates are spiking." The voice carried down the hallway with the kind of urgency that makes everyone in the vicinity stop what they're doing. Then another, "Customer complaints are flooding in." And finally, the one that made me pause mid-sip, "Where's the failure escalation team?" I walked back to my desk with measured steps, settled into my chair, and watched the beautiful chaos unfold through the glass walls of the war room. The new team was running around like headless chickens, each person frantically trying to solve problems they didn't fully understand. Jake was on the phone with someone, his voice getting higher with each sentence, his perfectly styled hair now disheveled from running his hands through it. Kevin was standing in the middle of the floor, turning in slow circles like a broken GPS trying to recalculate. The screens in the war room were painting a picture of digital apocalypse, red dashboards, error graphs trending upward, and customer satisfaction scores dropping in real time. The authentication system had finally succumbed to the memory leak, causing a cascade failure that was affecting every other service. The database was struggling under the increased load, query times were approaching timeout thresholds, and the customer service phone lines were jammed with confused and angry users. My phone buzzed. A text from Kevin, "Andrea, can you come to the war room? We need your help." I finished my coffee, noting that it had gone cold while I watched the disaster unfold. I checked my email, responding to a few non-urgent messages about strategic planning initiatives that seemed absurdly irrelevant in the current context. Then I stood up and walked to the war room with the measured pace of someone who had nowhere urgent to be, and who had seen this exact scenario play out in nightmares for months. "Andrea, thank God," Kevin said when I appeared in the doorway. His usually composed demeanor had cracked, revealing the kind of panic that comes from realizing your career might be on the line. "The failure reports are completely broken. Nothing's being escalated properly. We're getting bombarded with customer complaints and we have no visibility into what's actually happening." I surveyed the room like a general assessing a battlefield. Laptops everywhere, multiple screens showing red dashboards, and the kind of wide-eyed panic that comes from realizing you're in way over your head. The smell of stress sweat was competing with the vanilla air freshener. Someone had knocked over a coffee cup, and the brown liquid was slowly spreading across important-looking documents. "What seems to be the problem?" I asked, my voice carrying the calm of someone who had anticipated this exact scenario. Jake looked up from his laptop, sweat beading on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning. "The automated escalation system isn't working. Reports are coming in but they're not being categorized or prioritized. We don't know what's critical and what's just noise. The customer service team is completely overwhelmed." Behind him, I could see the customer service manager, Helen, frantically trying to coordinate responses to the flood of complaints. Her team was struggling to keep up with the volume, and without proper escalation procedures, they were treating every issue as equally urgent. The phone lines were jammed, the email queue was backing up, and social media mentions were starting to trend negative. "Ah," I said, nodding slowly. "The system I built. Can you fix it?" Kevin asked, his voice carrying the desperate hope of someone grasping at straws. I pretended to consider this, looking around the room at the assembled faces. The same faces that had been so confident about fresh perspectives and innovative approaches just weeks ago. The same management team that had decided my expertise was outdated and my approach too conservative. "Well, the issue is that the system isn't really broken in the traditional sense. It's more like, it was designed to work with someone who understood the context. The categorization algorithms rely on about 50 different variables that aren't documented anywhere. Customer complaint patterns, error code hierarchies, system interdependencies, it's all interconnected in ways that took me years to understand." The room fell silent except for the continued pinging of error notifications and the distant sound of customer service representatives trying to calm increasingly frustrated customers. I watched the color drain from Jake's face as he realized the magnitude of what they had lost when they removed me from the team. "But you know how it works, right?" Jake's voice had a pleading quality that I found oddly satisfying. "I do. But I'm in strategic planning now, remember? I wouldn't want to step on any toes or undermine the fresh perspectives you brought to the team." The silence stretched uncomfortably. Through the glass walls, I could see other employees gathering, drawn by the commotion. The local news was still running their positive coverage of our launch, completely unaware of the disaster unfolding in real time. The irony was almost too perfect. Kevin's face went through several interesting color changes before he spoke. "Andrea, I think there might have been a miscommunication about your role transition. We'd like you to come back to the launch team immediately." "In what capacity?" I asked, enjoying the moment more than I probably should have. "As the lead," he said, the words seeming to physically pain him. "We need you to take charge of the failure response and get this situation under control." I looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of the people who had been so eager to replace me with newer voices. The same people who were now realizing that institutional knowledge wasn't just corporate buzzword, it was the difference between success and catastrophic failure. "I'll need full access to all systems, direct report authority over the incident response team, and a guarantee that future team decisions will include proper knowledge transfer protocols," I said. "Done," Kevin replied without hesitation. I rejoined the launch team that afternoon, not as a member, but as the lead. The transition was surreal, walking back into the war room I'd been excluded from, sitting at the head of the table I'd been removed from, and watching the same colleagues who had awkwardly avoided eye contact during my transition suddenly hanging on my every word. It took me about 4 hours to stabilize the failure reporting system and get the escalation procedures back on track. The muscle memory was still there, the intuitive understanding of how the systems interconnected, which errors were symptoms and which were causes, how to prioritize the chaos into manageable chunks. I felt like a conductor returning to a familiar orchestra, each system responding to my touch with the precision of long practice. The first step was isolating the cascade failure. The authentication system memory leak had triggered a domino effect, but with proper understanding of the dependencies, I could restart services in the correct sequence to prevent further cascading. I guided Jake through the process, explaining the reasoning behind each step, turning the crisis into an impromptu training session. "Why did you restart the database connection pool before the authentication service?" he asked, genuinely curious now that his ego had been sufficiently humbled. "Because the authentication service will immediately attempt to establish new connections when it comes back online," I explained. "If the pool isn't ready, you get a secondary failure that's actually harder to recover from than the original problem." Within 2 hours, the error rates had stabilized. Within 4 hours, we were back to normal operation. The customer service team was caught up on their backlog, social media sentiment was improving, and the local news was still running their positive coverage, blissfully unaware of the near disaster that had been averted. The launch was salvaged, though not without significant damage to the team's reputation and several very uncomfortable calls with senior leadership. The CEO, Thomas, called an emergency meeting to understand what had happened and how to prevent similar incidents in the future. The conversation was a masterclass in corporate diplomacy, with everyone trying to explain the failure without directly blaming anyone. Jake remained on the team, but in a junior capacity. He was actually quite bright once he stopped pretending to know things he didn't. The experience had been humbling, but it had also been educational. He became one of my most dedicated students, eager to understand the systems he'd been tasked with managing. Kevin never mentioned newer voices again, and I noticed that subsequent team restructuring discussions included a lot more questions about institutional knowledge and documentation. The concept of fresh perspectives was quietly retired from the corporate vocabulary, replaced by discussions about experienced leadership and proven expertise. I did eventually formalize my failure reporting procedures, but not before negotiating a significant raise and a new title, Senior Systems Architect. The documentation process took 3 months and resulted in a comprehensive manual that new team members called the Andrea Bible. But I made sure to include plenty of references to the tribal knowledge that makes the system truly effective, the kind of understanding that comes only from years of experience and countless hours of troubleshooting. The best part? I still get to sit in meetings where people talk about giving newer voices a shot. The difference is that now I smile genuinely when they say it, because I know something they don't. Sometimes the oldest voice in the room is the one that's been trying to tell you what you need to hear all along. So here's the thing about institutional knowledge. It's not just about what you know, it's about what you know you don't know. The next time someone tells you they're bringing in fresh perspective, ask them who's going to handle the failure reports. Trust me, it's a conversation worth having, preferably before launch day, and definitely before you let the person who built your safety net walk away. And if you're the one being rotated out, smile graciously, and keep your coffee warm. You never know when you'll need to serve that perfectly room temperature revenge. Sometimes the best way to prove your worth is to let people discover it for themselves, preferably when they need you most.